In 1951, William Golding wrote a book that is still a sign for most of us to read in high school today. Lord of the Flies is about a group of boys stranded on an island. It's a dystopian story of devolution and what happens when man's instincts are left unchecked, either by social conditioning that comes with maturity or society altogether. When help finally arrives to save these boys, 3 of them are already dead. And the novel ends by telling us that one of the boys, named Ralph, wept for the end of innocence and for the darkness of man's soul. The moral of the story is unambiguous. It's the narrative version of John Calvin's, the Calvinist doctrine of total depravity. Human nature is completely incorrupt and entirely sinful, Calvin would say. The historian Rutger Bregman says, if there's one belief that has united the left and the right, psychologists and philosophers, ancient thinkers and modern ones, it is the tacit assumption that humans are bad. It's a notion that drives newspaper headlines and guides the laws that shape our lives. From Machiavelli to Hobbes, Freud to Pinker, the roots of this belief, he writes, have sunk deep into Western thought. Human beings, we are taught, are by nature selfish and governed primarily by self-interest. Woo-hoo! What a quote. But is it based in reality? He questions. The events of the last year and a half and the failure of so many to do the bare minimum to protect their neighbors does make a strong and compelling case that it might be. However, Bregman disagrees. In his book titled Humankind, A Hopeful History, the historian argues that reality and history actually illustrate an entirely different perspective, and that even this pandemic, despite its very loud outliers, is still no different. Humans are hardwired not for competition and domination, he writes, but for cooperation and kindness, and that is indeed the superpower that has made Homo sapiens absolutely dominant over the last 200,000 years and have assured that humans will survive another worldwide pandemic that very possibly could have wiped our species out if it were not for the cooperation of doctors and scientists, politicians and shipping moguls across the globe. The exceptions, he argues, only prove the rule, because never in the last year, from the time he was writing, did we really ever fear for our species' extinction. And why did we not if we did not know that we could cooperate and overcome? He ends by saying cooperation and kindness are what have made us powerful. And like Jesus in today's story, Bregman also reaches to children as his object lesson when he tells the real life story of the Lord of the Flies, of 6 boys shipwrecked on a deserted and desert island for 15 months. The real Lord of the Flies took place 15 years after the novel was published, and it stars 6 Catholic boys in a boarding school in Tonga. The oldest was 16, the youngest was 13, and the one thing all the boys had in common was that they were bored out of their minds. So they came up with a plan to escape to Fiji, some 500 miles away. They stole a small fishing boat from a man that none of them liked, and they hit the high sea. But that night, a storm crippled the boat, and the boys floated in the ocean for 8 days before landing on a small island. Today, the island is uninhabited and thought to be uninhabitable But by the time the boys were rescued, 15 months after they landed there, they had set up a small commune with a food garden, hollowed out tree trunks to store water. They even had a gymnasium with makeshift weights and a badminton court, chicken pens, and a permanent fire burning. In Golding's novel, The Lord of the Flies, the boys come to blows over keeping the fire burning. But in this real-life version, they tended the fire for over a year to keep it continuously burning. The kids agreed to work in teams of 2, drawing up a strict roster for garden, kitchen, and guard duty. Sometimes they quarreled, of course, and when they did, they imposed timeouts. And their days began and ended in song and prayer. They fashioned a makeshift guitar from a piece of driftwood, half a coconut, and 6 steel wires salvaged from the wrecked boat. Praise be to God indeed. Their biggest challenge came when one of them slipped and fell off of a cliff and broke his leg. The other boys had to carefully pick their way down to him to carry him up, make the arduous journey back up on top. They set his leg using sticks and leaves, but they kept him alive. And then on September 11th of 1966, 15 months after first landing on that island, the boys were rescued and taken in a boat back to Tonga, where they were promptly arrested because the fisherman whose sailing boat they stole more than a year ago was still angry and insisted on pressing charges. Bregman argues that we as people have a negative bias to focus on the bitter fisherman in our lives, to bemoan the human condition when, in fact, the larger story overwhelmingly supports the reality that humans are kinder and more cooperative than we often imagine. According to Bregman, the superpower that has made the human being totally dominant for the last 200,000 years isn't our viciousness or our competitiveness. It is our bent toward cooperation and kindness, the very characteristics that allowed these boys to survive for 15 months. The very characteristics that allowed us to save billions of lives during a global pandemic that very easily could have threatened our very existence. That is power. And Jesus uses children to make this very similar point today. Point about the very nature and substance of power itself. And he begins by teaching the disciples about his own power and where it's going to lead him to a cross. He's going to be arrested and tortured and killed. But it's actually through his sacrifice that he's going to lead the rest of us to life. It's necessary for the Messiah to do these things, he says, but the disciples don't understand because, well, the Messiahs are supposed to raise an army and kill, not suffer and die. And they don't get it. Neither would any of us in their shoes. And to illustrate their misunderstanding, the Bible story tells us that they began to argue about who among them was the greatest. So Jesus begins again. Whoever wants to be first among you must be last, he says. And knowing they probably need an illustration, he takes a child in his arms and he says, whoever welcomes this child in my name welcomes me. There's no honor in hosting a child. There's honor in hosting a king or a prince in your home, but not a child, especially not in this ancient world. But it's the child, Jesus argues, who most aptly illustrates the power of God. Our children have a power that many adults have forgotten how to wield. How many hard hearts have been softened by a newborn baby? And watch the hardest, most tatted up criminal hold a baby and they'll immediately go soft, trying to keep the baby comfortable and cooing to keep it calm. Prison guards with their training and batons are unable to do half as much through force. How many wounded men are healed through loving their own children? I am one. How many rocky relationships were motivated to work on loving one another because of their love for their children? Children have power, not in spite of their weaknesses, but because of them. One of my favorite stories that I've ever heard in my life, by my count, this will be the fourth opportunity you've had to hear it, but not the last, so if you don't pay attention, just wait, it'll come back around. It's about Bethany Dorian. Bethany manifested power everywhere she went, but power might not be the first word we thought of when we met Bethany, is it? I bet we all have a story, though, of coming to church one Sunday. Maybe you didn't really want to be here that Sunday. Had a little case of the Sunday blues. Then you heard Bethany say your name. What happened? He smiled. Instantly. In an instant, she could put the bleakness somewhere else and manifest joy in the present. All she had to do was say your name, reach out and grab your hand. That's power. After she died last year, I heard the story of her making friends in Pennsylvania before she moved down here. She had met a man at football games on Friday nights, a hard man. It's the way that John described him. A hard man, but Bethany got him, the way she got the rest of us. And that little girl in her chair, all 85 pounds of her, did what no able-bodied person ever had the power to do for that man. She taught him how to love. She loved him and she told him so. And for the very first time in his life, he told her that he loved her. He'd never said those words out loud before. When they moved from Pennsylvania down here to Texas, Bethany called him 5 or 6 days a week to talk to him, and he was kind to take her calls all the time. And before hanging up the phone, she would say, "I love you," and he would say, "I love you too." The only person in his life he could say that to. 5 or 6 times a week for several years. And then in spring, not this year, but last year, he got the news that Bethany had passed away, and those calls were not going to come anymore. So he picked up his phone, and he called his daughter, and for the very first time in his life, he told his own daughter that he loved her. That's power. That's the kind of power Jesus is trying to teach his disciples about. The kingdom of God is built on such power, and Bethany was connected to the source of it. Not in spite of her weakness, but because of it. There's a bedtime story that we read to Hadley sometimes that serves also as a parable on power. It's about sun and wind. The sun and wind, they make a bet to see who can get this man to take off his coat. I've heard the story. The wind goes first, and wind blows on him as hard as wind can and summons the coldest, most bitter, strongest wind in wind's arsenal and lets it rip for as long as wind can on this poor old man to try to blow his coat off of his shoulders. But the man, forced with this biting cold wind, just takes his jacket and pulls it tighter and tighter. And instead of getting it off, wind discovers that wind has done nothing but secure that coat even stronger, that all of wind's best efforts to win the bet to remove the coat have ensured the coat is even further from being off than it was before wind started trying to force the issue. Exasperated and out of breath, wind gives up and lets the sun have a turn. Well, sun just looks out, looks at the man with all of her face and smiles. Just lets her beams of radiance and warmth shine down on the man, who looks back up at her, smiles back, takes his coat off and sets it down on the ground beside him. Real power isn't about being able to dominate people or force your will on another. A kind of control over people is always short-term, momentary, and will disintegrate and erode. The kind of control over people will never last. True power, lasting power, is born of open arms, letting go of control in order to gain power. Jesus' kingdom doesn't force anyone to join it. It invites. And even more than it invites, it woos and warms. Buckminster Fuller says we never change things by fighting the existing reality. To change something, build a new model that makes the existing model obsolete. That's the nature of power in the kingdom of God. Jesus doesn't threaten people who don't follow him like many of his followers are fond of doing. Jesus builds a new reality, a new kingdom reality, one in which cooperation is more profitable than competition, where kindness and sharing are signs of strength, and hoarding is simply unnecessary. Martin Dempsey argues much the very same about leadership in today's world. Dempsey is a 41-year-old Army veteran, a 4-star general who knows a thing or two about power. He ended his career working first as the Chief of Staff of the U.S. Army and then as the Chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, which made him the senior officer in all of the armed forces and the principal military advisor to the President of the United States. So he wrote a book about his leadership style, a book he calls Radical Inclusion, what the post-9/11 world should have taught us about leadership. It's a pretty good subtitle, isn't it? In the book, he makes several counterintuitive claims about the nature of power and successful leadership, but one of those claims, after years spent overseeing the efforts in Iraq and Afghanistan, he writes, is that seeking domination is a surefire way to forfeit what power we have. Instead, letting go of control by building cooperation and collaborating is the only way to both maintain power and be a successful modern leader. And the conventional leader, he argues, when he or she begins to lose control, their instincts are to clamp down, fight harder, exert their will even more fiercely. And this reaction to dominate, according to Dempsey, is exactly the wrong one. For it only fuels our dissidents and radicalizes our enemies. And if the leader wants to maintain power, then we should instead open our arms and invite more people to the table to share control and ownership, because that's the only place we're going to find the real solutions to the real problems, he says. Radical inclusion is the only style of leadership that makes sense in a post-9/11 world, he writes. Not because inclusion is special, but because it works. Dempsey is articulating for political and business leaders a spiritual truth that Jesus has been preaching for a long time. Whoever wants to be first must be last of all and servant of all. The power of God is the power of the sun to warm a cold day and a cold spirit. It's the power of children to inspire love in a hard heart. The power of an inclusive community where diversity sparks the imagination of even the most dejected cynic. The kingdom of God is built by and the source of such power. Maybe we, just like the disciples in Jesus' story today, need children to help us unlearn a few things about ourselves and our world too. I took Hadley to the fancy park a few weeks ago down here on 36, the new one. We were there about 10 minutes or so when I noticed that there was another little girl that seemed to be about Hadley's age following us around. So I turned to Hadley and I said, "I think you have a friend who wants to play with you." So Hadley turned and walked over to her, which isn't something Hadley normally does to strangers, but she did that day, to my relief. The little girl asked Hadley, "Will you be my friend?" In the way children do. And Hadley nodded, still not talking. The little girl asked Hadley, "Do you want to play castle?" And Hadley nodded again. So they ran to the playground equipment and climbed up, and one by one over the next 15 or 30, probably about 30 minutes really, they invited each of the other kids there at the park to join them. Before long, there was about a dozen kids, black, white, Asian, Latino, all joined together playing castle, taking turns as princesses and knights, according to Hadley. Those children were able to assemble a more diverse social order in castle in 30 minutes than most of our churches have been able to do in as many years. Children aren't angels. They have the same dark impulses we all have, but there's much that we can learn about the kingdom of God and its power from them. Not despite their weaknesses and their vulnerabilities, but precisely because of them. The Apostle Paul writes, "But God said to me, 'My grace is sufficient for you, for my power is made perfect in your weakness.'" So Paul says, "Therefore I will boast all the more gladly about my weaknesses, so that Christ's power may rest in me." This is the word of the Lord. Thanks be to God.